In this video, I'll be showing you guys how to make a two-part silicone mold for a prop, sword, gun, or any kind of weapon, just like this one. The first step is to take a sheet material. Now, this can be anything from plywood, MDF, styrene, but in this video I'm going to be using foam board because it's light, cheap, and it's easy to cut. Once you have your sheet material, lay your weapon on top of it and trace around the outside using a pencil or marker. Make sure that you trace it close in. Next, cut out the shape you traced on the sheet material. Because I chose foam board, I can use a simple Stanley knife or an X-Acto knife to cut out. This foam board will help you split your prop weapon into two even halves. Now, as I slip this over the sword, you can see there are two issues. The first issue is that the foam board doesn't actually sit at the halfway mark of the sword. The second issue is you can also see that the blade, the tip of the blade, is dipping down more than the start of the blade. Now, as you can see, what I'm doing here is I'm slipping some foam underneath the blade. This is me trying to even out and make it all completely horizontal. This just helps you make it a nice even half-half mold. Once you have the blade nice and horizontal, you can fix the problem with the foam not sitting at the halfway mark by adding foam along the outside edges of the bit you cut out. And you can see me doing it now. As you can see, the foam now sits much better on the prop, and the front part of the blade, when I press on it, doesn't move very much. This will very much help you when you're making your mold. The next step is to take some clay and press it into long strips. I'm using a oil-based clay, that way it doesn't dry, and I can use it again for future molds. The next step is to take those clay strips and place them all around the outside of the edge that you cut out in the center, as you can see what I'm doing. Make sure that the clay, when you press it down flat, overhangs the edge of the area you cut out by about 1 centimeter. Next, take your prop and press it into the cutout area, as you can see me doing. This will push the clay down over the edge and will start to seal around the edges of your prop weapon. Now, of course, pressing into the clay won't make a perfect seam straight away. So you're going to need to take some clay tools and you're going to want to smooth out the edge. What I'm doing here is I'm pressing the clay right up against the edge of the prop, and then I'm using a clay tool to smooth it out and make it a nice clean edge. Once you finish that, you may notice some clay on the edges of your prop. Now, you don't actually want clay onto the surface of your prop, so take a small cloth or a tissue and you can wipe it away quite easily. You might want to buff that area just to make sure that all the clay is gone before moving on to the next step. The next step is to take a clay tool and carve a channel into the excess clay. This is used for registration. This should help the two halves of your mold line up much more easily and make sure that your seam line is much nicer. Once you've finished doing a channel all the way around, it should look like this. Think about is where you're going to put your pour spout and where in this model air might get trapped. So the first thing I'm going to do is I think I'm going to put my pour spout here. The reason for this is that if I put my pour spout at the end, which a lot of people would probably tend to do, when I pour all the volume of the liquid in here, the seam at the bottom here, opposite end of the pour spout, is going to be bearing all of the pressure of the weight of all the liquid plastic that's going to go into the mold. And so it's more likely that the bottom here, part of the mold, will split, the two halves will split open. So I'm doing it on the side here, because that means that the volume and therefore the pressure of all the liquid plastic will be evenly spread across this horizontal, this very wide side of the mold instead, making it less chance of it actually busting open. So once you've decided where to put your pour spout, you need to think about where air might get trapped in your mold. So what you got to think about is where is higher? Where are the highest points on your model? So the highest points here on this side are here, here, and here. Now here's where my pour spout is, so I don't have to worry about air getting trapped there. But if you think about the liquid plastic level rising, once it rises to about this point here, you can see this part's separate, there will be air that will get trapped all up here and then along here. So this area will have trapped air, and also if you think about the liquid plastic rising here, once it hits here, this area here will have air trapped in it. So you're going to want to put risers, which is little paths for the air to escape, going through this section. So to do that, you just have you just roll out a very thin sort of rod of clay and attach it to the model here and here for risers, and you want those to go towards your pour spout and join with your pour spout. Or you could have them just go straight up in the direction of the top of the mold. Finally, before we move on to adding rubber, you're gonna want to do one more registration thing for the two sections of silicone to fit together. What I like to do is I like to do sort of like a centimeter high wall of clay that goes all the way around the edge as well, just so it has another thing that'll help register it together. So to do that, what you're gonna do is take a ball of clay, a block of clay, and you're gonna want to squish it into sort of like a wafer or a biscuit kind of shape, and you want to get it sort of around sort of 1.5 centimeters thickness, just to give you a nice lip of a wall going all the way around the piece. Once you flattened it out, you can then take a clay knife or a Stanley knife and you can cut it into strips. It doesn't have to be particularly large strip. Once you have a bunch of strips cut out, and obviously I'm going to need more for this large piece, you can start laying them out around the outside, just right along the edge, not too close to your previous registration mark, but not too far out either, because there's no need, and you'll end up using more silicone if it's too far out. And you can just add these walls all the way along, all the way around the outside. And you can use these cut off bits as well. You basically just need a placeholder. You can always widen up these registration marks by cutting out silicone material once you've poured the first half, so I wouldn't worry about it. And once you've actually gone all the way around with this wall, what you can do is you can make sure that you've actually smoothed down the edges around the outside, so that once you pour the silicone, it doesn't actually get underneath it. And once you have your clay wall all the way around, I left a little gap around the pour spout just to save a bit of time. It's not really necessary up here so much. Once you have it done, you can move on to adding silicone for the first half. Now that you're ready to start molding, you want to make sure that the surface of your prop is free from all dust and oily finger marks, because these can show up in your silicone mold. Take a cloth and just wipe down the surface gently. Then you'll want to spray a release agent onto your mold. Then you'll want to spray a release agent onto your prop. I'm using MAN 200 release agent. That's MANN 200. It's a thin, clear film that sprays onto your weapon. You're going to want to let this sit and dry for about 5 minutes, depending or longer depending on how thick a coat you've put on. I suggest you don't put on too thick a coat. You can also use melted down Vaseline as a release agent, or any spray wax. The release sit for a bit to dry up. What I'm going to do is a print coat, which is the first layer of silicone. It's a thin layer, and it's meant to be as bubble free as you can get it, because that's the layer that's pressed right up against the mold, and if you have any bubbles in there, then there's going to be bubbles in the surface of your mold. The thing I like to do actually is I'm going to mix up a very small amount of silicone first, just to get into the small detail areas. Basically when there's small grooves, lines, scribed lines, etched lines, stuff like that, it's quite difficult for the silicone to get in there without creating bubbles. So what I'm going to do, like on this one here along the grip, there are these dimples which could catch air. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I have a very small, very small amount of silicone and just fill in these dimples on the grip first before I mix up a larger batch for the rest of the first print coat. That just means that I don't have to sort of worry about spending not too much time on this area, worrying about the rest of the cup, curing or getting too thick whilst I'm working on this section. So I'm going to do that first, and then I'm going to put the rest of the print coat on. One of the tools I have here to help me is an airbrush. Airbrushes are actually pretty useful for molding because it helps you pop surface bubbles in the silicone, as well as sort of force silicone into grooves and things like that that are quite difficult to access. So I'll be using this just to sort of help me get the silicone right into the dimples there and pop any bubbles on the surface of my print coat. Now that I've done the small details, I'm going to start pouring my first batch of silicone on. I'm pouring from high up so that the stream is very thin when it hits the mold. This helps remove air that you may have mixed into your silicone when you were mixing your silicone with the catalyst. So remember to always pour from high up. Okay, so now the first print coat has been left to sit for a while. It's pretty much cured. It's still kind of sticky, but it doesn't pull up with my finger anymore. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a second print coat, but this time with very little silicone, because as you can hopefully see, if I zoom in here, there are sections like here where you can see the color of the item underneath. That's because the silicone is very thin there, and that tends to happen when you have a ridge that goes straight down, or even at an angle, just on the actual edge itself. Silicone tends to sort of, flow away from that area. So it's a good idea to put another bit of silicone on top of that, just to try to thicken it up a little bit on these thin areas before you go and do your final coats of silicone. So I'll do that, and then we'll move on to a thicker coat of silicone. Once you have your second print coat on, you can move on to your thick coat. Now, to thicken up your silicone, it depends on what kind of silicone you have. If you have any of the smooth-on silicones, then you're in luck because they have a thickener that you can buy off of their website. This makes it really easy to thicken up your silicone by adding a few drops of the liquid thickener. Now for me, I don't have smooth-on products, so what I do is I mix in silicone powder. This also ends up thickening up the silicone without really affecting its properties very much. So I'm going to mix in some silicone to this powder, and I'll do the thick layer. Okay, so I've mixed up my thicker silicone, and as you can see here, it is much thicker. It's about the consistency of icing, and it just really sticks to its surface, even if it's sort of like vertical, which makes it really easy for you to paste it up against things like the walls and any vertical edges. So what you're going to do now is you're going to cover it all up. Be sure to go around the outside of these walls, the clay walls, and make sure that you've got about about half a centimeter thick rubber around. You're gonna have to kind of estimate with how thick it is, but yeah, just apply until you're pretty confident that it's a nice thick mold and that it won't be too thin in any areas. So I'm going to apply the thick coat now. Now, whilst I'm putting on the thick coat of silicone, I'm also placing these blocks of cured silicone onto the top. Now, these are called mold keys. They are old blocks of silicone that I have ready to place on the top layer of a mold. This just helps the silicone jacket line up with the fiberglass jacket. The fiberglass jacket is a hard fiberglass shell that helps keep the rubbery silicone in shape, because if you didn't have a hard jacket, then the silicone would just sort of flop around and it wouldn't give you a proper reproduction of your prop. So to make these mold keys, I just filled a plastic disposable cup with silicone, mixed in the catalyst, let it cure, and then I cut the plastic cup off, leaving me this big block of cured silicone, which I just cut up into chunks to use as mold keys. Okay, so now that you've finished the first half of the silicone mold, you're pretty much ready to go on to making the fiberglass jacket. One thing I would suggest you do before you move on to the fiberglass jacket is just to trim off all this sort of very thin silicone, which is just excess around the edge here, you can see. So just take a Stanley knife and do a little trim around the edge.